like to thank you all for coming to the Langley Adams Library here in Groveland. And I wanted to welcome Jerry D'Entremont. This is at least his second time.
I think it's just the second time,
Okay.
as far as I can remember. Yeah, last April I was here.
And
You've been nice enough to invite me to be here tonight and to come back again in October.
yes, he'll be coming back in October 29th for Haunted Lighthouses. So hopefully you all be back then. That should be a fun evening. And
Fun and a little spooky, but I
a little
won't scare you too bad.
And
Go easy on you.
he's brought several books of his. He's written 9 books, and he's the founder of the American Lighthouse Foundation. Is that
Not
right?
the founder, I wouldn't claim
Okay.
that. I'm an ex-president and I'm the historian for the American Lighthouse Foundation.
So,
Yes.
and
Founder of one of the chapters, actually, the Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses, which I'll talk about tonight.
I'll let him continue with his presentation. Enjoy.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much. I'm going to switch this slide off because you don't really need to see me so well as long as you can see the pictures here. That's the important thing. So thank you all. This is great to see another excellent turnout here. Thank you all for coming. I have a lot of ground to cover tonight. I'm only talking about 5 lighthouses tonight. The 5 lighthouses between the Isles of Shoals up to the York, Maine area. But still, there's plenty to talk about. I could probably fill up a lecture with any one of those lighthouses pretty easily. But I always start by saying there are many reasons why people love lighthouses. For me, it's the human history. It's the stories of keepers and their families. I've been doing lighthouse stuff for more than 25 years now. It was first their photographic qualities that attracted me, and I've taken zillions of pictures of lighthouses. But the thing that kept me interested and keeps me interested in lighthouses is really the human history, the stories of keepers and their families. And it's important to note that that history is fading into the past because every lighthouse in this country is now automated. The traditional way of life of lighthouse keepers is really fading into the past at this point. Every lighthouse is automated. We have one official lighthouse keeper in the United States. I don't know if anybody knows where that is. I'm sure there are people here who do know the answer to that question. Yes, Boston is correct. A woman named Sally Snowman is the keeper there. That is how she pronounces her name. But even there, the light is automated, so it's not really the traditional job. She helps with tours and administration type stuff, but I'm not saying it's not important, but traditional lighthouse keeping is really fading into the past, and I do my best to try to keep alive as many of these stories as I can so we don't forget how important these people were to our maritime history. Our country was based on maritime commerce. Without lighthouse keepers, you couldn't have the safe movement of commerce, so they were extremely important. So, with that said, I'm going to jump into my tour here, and I'm going to start with the Nubble Light and work my way down the coast. And this one, I'm sure, is familiar to most people in this room, if not everybody. I'm just curious, how many of you have gone to York, have seen the Nubble in person? Okay, I figured almost everybody would raise their hands, and I was right. As you know, you don't quite get there. You go to see it, you go to Sawyer Park in York, you park your car, depending on where you're from, park your car in York, and you see it across that channel there, about 100 feet of water. I think that's part of its allure to me, part of its appeal, that you don't quite get there. It's kind of a little bit of mystery to it. I've been lucky enough to get on the island twice. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it is, of course, located off the eastern tip of Cape Nettic. It's funny, the geography around there is confusing. Historically, this is Cape Nettic, this little point of land. But if you ask anybody who lives on that point of land, they'll tell you that's the Nubble. They say that's the Nubble neighborhood. Everybody, that's what they call it there. But if you look on a map, it says Cape Nettic, so it depends on who you ask. But the name Nubble, by the way, technically refers to just the little rocky island itself where the lighthouse stands. And that name was given by Captain John Smith and his crew. Are there any seats? Two people. Are they getting any seats? Okay, good.
There's one back there.
There's one here, but we have 2 people here. I guess she's getting seats for them. Anyway, Captain John Smith, when he was exploring the New England coast in 1614, he named a lot of things. Some of his names stuck, some of them didn't. But they called this little island Nubble after similar little rocky islands in the British Isles. It's an old name for small rocky islands over there. It's a diminutive of knob or nub, basically. So there were calls for lighthouse on the Nubble going back as early as 1807. Oh, also, let me just explain, I have Cape Nettic, quote, Nubble Light. Cape Nettic Light is the official name of this lighthouse. If you look in official records, it's always referred to as Cape Nettic Light or Light Station, but everybody calls it the Nubble Light that's on that Nubble Island. There were calls for a lighthouse there as early as 1807. There were shipwrecks in the vicinity. It is basically in shipping lanes going up and down the coast. It's also about 2 miles north of the entrance to the York River and York Harbor. There was a shipwreck there in 1842, among others. In 1842, the Isidore wrecked just a little bit up the coast from there, and it's kind of a ghostly legend attached to that. They say the Isidore reappears as a phantom ship with a skeleton crew going up and down the coast. And after that, there was a call for a lighthouse, but it kept getting put off, largely because the authorities said there were already enough lighthouses in the area. They felt with Boone Island Light, established in 1811 offshore from there, and Portsmouth Harbor Light not far to the south, then Goat Island Light up in Kennebunkport not too far north. They felt there were already enough lighthouses in the vicinity, but finally there were another petition for a lighthouse, and in the 1870s the Congress appropriated $15,000 for a lighthouse. I don't think you could build much for $15,000 today. But they did build the lighthouse and keeper's house in 1879. This is part of the plans for the lighthouse. It is a cast iron tower similar to a lot of lighthouses built around that time. Portsmouth Harbor Light is extremely similar. There are several on Cape Cod. Basically several cast iron cylinders bolted together, lined with brick, and with a cast iron spiral stairway inside. And the keepers, of course, and their families lived not inside the lighthouse, but in the keeper's house next to the lighthouse. Here's a very early photo of it, and there's a few changes since this photo was taken. This is probably 1900-ish. For one thing, the very familiar covered walkway that connects the keeper's house and the lighthouse wasn't there yet. That was added in 1911. And there's a fog bell tower over here that's no longer there. Also, the little red oil house, that's a very distinctive part of the scene there, wasn't built until 1903. Here's another early postcard, and by this time the little red oil house was there. Those oil houses were built to store kerosene for the light during the kerosene era, and you'll always notice they're not too close to the other buildings for obvious reasons. If you had a fire with the kerosene, you wouldn't want it right next to the keeper's house or the lighthouse. Again, you see the fog bell tower here, and here's a closer view showing the original fog bell tower at the Noble. These types of towers were common at lighthouses for many years, and basically, you see the bell hanging here on the side. And in times of very poor visibility, the keeper would go in this shed and he would crank up like a clockwork type mechanism. Weights would rise up in the tower here, and as the weights gradually fell, that drove a hammer that would come out of a slot here and hit the bell every so many seconds, kind of like a Rube Goldberg kind of machine. They worked most of the time. It was the best technology they had for that at the time, but there's a lot of stories about those mechanisms failing and the keeper having to go out with his pocket watch and either pulling a rope or using a hammer to hit the bell every so many seconds for hours and hours on end, or family members taking turns. I've read quite a few of those stories. This bell tower was eventually replaced by an enclosed bell tower that you'll see in some of the pictures. Here's another early postcard. I love this one because what you're seeing here is one of the early keepers in the early 1900s rowing some people. I'm not sure if they're going to or from the island, but he's ferrying some people there. Right from the start, when the Noble Light was built, the keepers recognized the fact that it was a tourist attraction. People were going to see it right away when it was built. So some of the early keepers capitalized on it being a tourist attraction. And there was one early keeper, William Brooks, and I believe that's him in this photo here, who would ferry people. He'd give them a round trip for 10 cents a piece to the island. Once they got on the island, if they wanted a tour of the lighthouse, they would pay his wife another 5 cents for a tour of the lighthouse. He wasn't supposed to be doing that. He was supposed to be paying attention to the light and fog signal, not paying attention to tourists. And they say that when he was doing that on like a Sunday afternoon in summer, he'd have as many as 300 or 400 people on the island, and he would provide fishing gear if they wanted to fish. So the authorities found out, and that was the end of his flight-keeping career. He did go on to run a hotel at York Beach, so I think he was more suited to the hospitality industry than the lighthouse keeper. So things worked out okay for him. And some of the other keepers later on, there was another keeper later on who was fired for pretty much the same reasons. Here's an aerial shot showing the second fog bell tower there. This tower, by the way, was torn down in the early 1960s. I don't know if anybody here remembers it out there, but it was there until I believe 1961. And here's the covered walkway. You don't see it too many lighthouses. The ones that had them, a lot of those walkways are gone now, but the Noble still has this walkway, so that in times of very cold weather or storms or whatever, the keeper could go back and forth without having to go outside between the lighthouse lighthouse and the keeper's house. There's so many stories I could tell you, but I want to tell you about Eugene Coleman, who was a keeper 1930 to 43. He was at Nauset Light on Cape Cod for a long time before he came here. In fact, this picture is at Nauset Light with his wife, Amanda. And when he came to the Nubble, he inherited a cat from a previous keeper. Like 2 keepers before him, a keeper named James Burke had left this cat behind. I guess the cat didn't want to leave the island. He was very attached to it. His name was Sambo Tonkus. Don't ask me why he got that name. He's a 19-pound tabby. His nickname was Mr. T. This is, I think, long before the other famous Mr. T. Sambo Tonkus, or Mr. T, became very famous because the visitors to the Nubble would be very surprised. They'd be looking at the lighthouse, and all of a sudden they'd realize this giant cat was swimming across the channel back and forth. The cat got bored on the island. They say he probably caught all the rats and mice, whatever there was in the island, got very bored. So he would swim across the channel 3 or 4 times a day and hunt for mice in the rocks. You don't expect to see a cat swimming across the channel like that. I don't think Sambo Tonkus fished while he was doing that, but there are stories of at least a couple of fishing cats at a couple of other lighthouses. At Palmer Rocks Lighthouse in Providence, Rhode Island, on the Providence River, there was a cat named Tommy that would fish all the time, and they say when he was fishing in the river, you'd see just his tail sticking up above the water, and he would catch little fish and pile them up on the island until he had enough for dinner. Then he'd sit there and contented to eat his dinner. There's so many animal stories at lighthouses. I've done a lecture just on that topic before. This is obviously a pretty recent picture, but I'm showing this because I think you're probably all familiar with this basket that hangs on one of the cables going over to the island. That was added in the Coast Guard era. Just to be clear, the Coast Guard took over lighthouses in this country in 1939. Before that, it was usually referred to as the U.S. Lighthouse Service. The keepers were civilian employees of the federal government. But the Coast Guard took over in 1939. In the 1950s, the Coast Guard put this basket there, or an earlier version of it, to make it easier for the keepers and families for them to send supplies over to them, or back and forth mail also, to make it easier so they didn't always have to come over by boat every time they wanted to send something one way or the other. But it was not intended for people, but one keeper had another idea about it. So in 1967, a Coast Guard keeper named David Winchester, he had 2 school-age kids, a son and a daughter. He got tired of rowing his kids across the channel every morning to get the school bus and picking them up in the afternoon. So he started putting them one at a time in the basket to go to school. And there's a very famous picture here taken in 1967. That is his 7-year-old son, Ricky Winchester, on his way to school. This was taken by a Boston Globe photographer. I've had people look at this and say, oh, he looks scared. I don't think he looks scared at all. I think he looks extremely blank, like sort of like, what are you looking at? I'm just going to school. You know? What's the big deal here? And you see his dad waving to him back here on the island. This picture was picked up by the Associated Press. It ran in newspapers all over at least all over the country, I think maybe all over the world. The commander of the 1st Coast Guard district saw it, was not pleased at all. They weren't supposed to be doing that. Obviously the parents wouldn't have done it if they thought it was dangerous, but anyway, they were ordered not to do that anymore, and they had to board their kids on the mainland after that, and that was the end of sending school-age kids to the Nubble. So they were the last family with school-age kids there. I have heard stories about other people riding in the basket even if they weren't supposed to, but I don't know the details on those. The last keeper at the Nubble was this man, Russ Algren, left in 1987 when the light was automated. He lived there with his wife Brenda and their son Chris. Brenda Algren wrote a very poignant letter the night before the light was being automated and they were due to leave. She wrote that it was in the fog and they all sat out by the lighthouse, and she said she felt very, very sad. She said they could see the red flash of the light and that the foghorn was sounding. And she said they felt extremely sad, and she couldn't help crying because there was this fear that the buildings would be abandoned, that once the keeper was removed and family, that there wouldn't be anybody there, that the buildings would be susceptible to vandalism and fall to ruin and be neglected and so forth. Luckily, that didn't happen because the town of York stepped in. Soon after the light was automated, the town leased the property from the Coast Guard, and they have taken wonderful care of it. They actually got ownership of all the buildings in the late 90s under what's called the Maine Lights program, through which about 28 lighthouses were transferred to communities or nonprofits in the late 90s. So the Nubble is lucky. It is on an island, which makes it a little difficult to maintain, but at least it's very close to the mainland, so it's not too hard to get to. So the town Parks and Recreation Department has really done a wonderful job with it. As I said, not many people get onto the island. I've been lucky enough to get on there twice, once with the Coast Guard when they were inspecting the lens out there, and a couple of years ago with some of the parks people when they were painting the lighthouse. Excuse me. This is the lens that's still in place out there. This is a beautiful 19th century lens. Those of you who are lighthouse buffs know about Fresnel lenses. Capital F-R-E-S-N-E-L, after Augustin Jean Fresnel, the French scientist who invented them in 1822. And to make it quick, the basic idea of the Fresnel lenses is the prisms focus and concentrate the light into a very powerful horizontal beam. So they're an extremely efficient type of lens that was much more efficient than anything that came before that. Out of 68 lighthouses in Maine, only 9 of them still have their so-called classical Fresnel lenses. Most have been replaced by various kinds of little acrylic lenses, or now LEDs are the coming things for offshore lights. And I'll try to not get too much into editorial comment, but luckily a lot of the lenses were saved and are in museums also. Here's a cast iron stairway inside the Nubble light with the brick lining. Most of these cast iron lighthouses have brick for added durability and insulation also. And the Nubble is one of a few lighthouses that on its, what they call the lantern gallery, the deck around the top part of the lighthouse, the finials on top of the railing are little miniature cast iron lighthouses. So that's a neat little architectural feature that you might not realize unless you've got on the lighthouse. But if you're over there, next time you're there, if you have a long lens or binoculars, take a look at the finials. You can see them from the mainland if you have a good long lens. It's pretty neat. I only know about 6 or 7 lighthouses that have that. Also, the town of York lights up the buildings every Christmas season. I'm sure some of you have seen that. They have a big event at the start of the Christmas season where everybody gathers there. They sing Christmas carols and everybody counts down 10 to 1. And they light up the lights. This past Christmas season, on the night of the lighting of the Nubble, my wife and I went to it, but there was a surprise snowstorm, so we didn't stay because it was so cold and it was snowing, so we left early. I found out the next day there was an electrical malfunction and the lights never came on that night. Were you there?
No, we were gonna go.
Then you heard about that?
No, I was too sick to go. So I said, wow, we didn't miss anything.
No, you didn't miss anything. Yeah, as it turned out. Of course, it's always nice to be there anyway. But anyway. And they light them up again for a couple of weeks in the summer for the summer visitors as well. Working down the coast just a little bit to Boone Island Light, which is approximately 6 to 8 miles offshore, depending on what point of land you're talking about. It's said to be about 6 miles, but I think it's a little bit more than that, from the tip of Cape Nettic, about 9 miles, maybe a little bit more east of the town of Kittery. Nobody would ever accuse this lighthouse of being pretty. I would never say that, but to me it's one of the most interesting lighthouses anywhere. I wrote a book on lighthouses of Maine, and this was the longest chapter. And to me it's absolutely fascinating that families lived on this little, miserable little pile of rocks for so long, so far offshore. There's nothing left there now but the lighthouse tower, tallest lighthouse in New England, 133 feet tall. Solar panels here, there's a little generator shed, and there's the remains of what was one of the keeper's houses. There's a little bit of a stone wall still standing there, but not much. Long before there was a lighthouse there were shipwrecks. There were a number of shipwrecks there on this dangerous ledge over the years. It's a small island, but extending out from the island are dangerous ledges for quite a ways, and at low tide especially, it's extremely dangerous. In December of 1710, a British ship called the Nottingham Galley was wrecked at Boone Island. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with the novel Boone Island by Kenneth Roberts. Maybe some of you have read that. This was one of the most famous or infamous shipwrecks of the 18th century. It was kind of the most famous shipwreck of its day before the Bounty wasn't really a shipwreck, but it's kind of replaced this as the big maritime story of that era. But anyway, Captain John Dean of the Nottingham Galley has been built up as a hero in some places. Now there's a new book coming out that kind of paints him as a scoundrel, so there's a lot of debate about him. There were 14 men on this ship, and it was wrecked in December during a storm. Miserable weather, like a sleet storm. 14 men, 10 of them survived about a month on the island, it's just a phenomenal story of survival. 2 of them died on the island, 2 of them died in a raft trying to get to shore. And as some of you may know, if you know anything about the story, that the 10 men who survived did resort to very desperate measures. When the second man died on the island, there was some cannibalism involved. And part of why I tell you that is because it figures in another story. I'll tell you a little bit later, a ghost story. But anyways, this is probably the most famous shipwreck that ever happens at Boone Island, but it still took quite a while for a lighthouse to be built there. First in 1799, they put an unlighted tower there to serve as what they call a day mark, just to mark the ledge during the day, so at least vessels would avoid it during the day. And finally, in 1811, a lighthouse was put there. This is not the 1811 lighthouse, this is the present one. We don't have any pictures of the earlier structures, but it was a much shorter wooden lighthouse originally. And was rebuilt twice. The present lighthouse was built in 1855. One of the longest serving keepers was a man named Eliphalet Grover, and this is a letter he wrote that I got a copy of from the National Archives, and it's really hard to read. Don't try to read it. I have a pretty good copy of it, but you'll kill your eyes trying to read it. But basically, he's complaining about the conditions out there. He said that time and time again there would be huge storms where the island was awash. It was basically underwater. Waves would be sweeping right over the island. There were many times when he and later keepers and families had to go up in the lighthouse tower so they wouldn't be swept away in storms. That was not an uncommon occurrence there. He reported once or twice that in storms everything movable was washed away. That was a fairly common description of storms out there. So he complained about his pay. I believe he was paid $450 a year for quite a while. Finally, as I say right here, his pay was raised to $600 a year by 1837. It was a little more money than there is now. You didn't get rich being a lighthouse keeper, though. But for many, many years, the lighthouse keepers of Boone Island were among the highest paid lighthouse. At times, they were the highest paid lighthouse keepers in the country at Boone Island, because it was considered hazard pay. It was considered such a miserable place. Eliphalet Grover, he certainly did plenty of work, but he also had free time, and to pass his free time, he would carve things out of wood. One of the things he made was this fiddle. It's not a Stradivarius by any means, but it's a nice piece of folk art. It is now in the collection of the York Historical Society, and as it says here, he made it out of pieces of red spruce and some roof shingles. And I'll show you a couple of close-ups. It's got like a face on the head of the fiddle. And a guy named Stephen Mallory, a preservation expert and also a musician, restored it, and he recorded an album of tunes with this. And I'm not going to play this whole thing, but I'm just going to play a little bit of this cut. So you hear it's kind of a unique sound, this fiddle. So let me go ahead and play a little bit of this. On for a while, but I like the sound. Interestingly, that fiddle was used, it was played by a man named John Thompson in a church in York, and Thompson went on to become a keeper at Boone Island. And I don't know what he played. When I hear that album, I picture Eliphalet Grover playing the fiddle at the top of the lighthouse in a snowstorm. At least that's what I imagine. So he was there 23 years, and lighthouse keeper jobs in that era were very political. It depended on who you knew. Later on, after we established a more efficient lighthouse board in 1852, it became more about qualifications and how good a job you did. But in the early days, it was who you knew and what political party you supported. And if you supported the wrong political party, or the other party came into power locally or even nationally, you could easily be thrown out of your job. So Eliphalet Grover, apparently for political reasons, was removed in 1839. It was a miserable job, but at least it was a job, and he wasn't happy when he was removed. This is his very last entry in his logbook when he lost his job. I think he meant turned out of or turned off of Boone Island after serving as lighthouse keeper 22 years and 10 months and 20 days without cause. He did later become keeper at Whaleback Light for a brief time. I will be telling you about Whaleback Light in a little while. Skipping ahead to the 1870s, it's just amazing to me that families lived again on this little miserable pile of rocks for so many years. Here's a picture of some kids, I don't know who they are, but children of one of the keepers in front of the keeper's house there at Boone Island. In 1876, a daughter of one of the keepers, her name was Annie Bell Hobbs. Her father was I can't think of his first name, but his assistant keeper named Hobbs. And she wrote an article for a children's magazine called Nursery about living at Boone Island. And it goes quite a bit longer than this, but I just love these first two paragraphs. Out at sea on a rock 8 miles from the nearest point of land and about 9 miles east of the town of Kittery is Boone Island, upon which I have been a prisoner with privilege of the yard for the past 2 years. Up there among the clouds, my father and the other keepers have to watch night after night through storms as well as pleasant weather, through summer and winter, the year round, from sunset to sunrise, so that the poor sailors may be warned off from danger. I don't know how many 14-year-old kids these days you could get to live in a little pile of rocks 6 miles offshore year-round without their iPhones and video games, etc. Of course, there was no choice. She didn't have any choice in the matter. And you see that she felt like a prisoner, but at the same time you get a sense that she appreciated why they were there. She knew how important it was. One of Annie's duties while she was there was to give tours. If anybody showed up, usually it would be in the summer, that somebody might land in a boat and say they wanted a tour of the lighthouse, and she would take them up the 175 steps to the top of the tower and give them a tour. And if she was lucky, she might get a nickel or a dime for her trouble. If she was really lucky. Probably didn't usually get anything. But that was the typical duty for a lighthouse keeper's kid in those days. William C. Williams here. William Converse Williams from Kittery was the longest serving keeper in the history of Boone Island Light. Waiting for the 7 bells to finish here. And you see, of course, his wife, Mary Abby Williams here. He, again, was a local guy from Kittery, and later after he retired, when he was in his 90s, he was interviewed for a book, and he said that when he was a young man and he went out to Boone Island, all he could think about was how he would escape if there was a huge storm and all the buildings were falling down. Luckily that never happened, but there were again many times when he and the other keepers had to go up in the lighthouse because the island was underwater. In his days, for most of his term there, it was still a family station. Families lived out there. His wife lived out there year-round for a number of years, although they would rotate like 3 keepers after a while, so there might be 3 keepers assigned and 2 on duty at any time. They might have 2 weeks on and a week off, that kind of thing. But he basically spent at least 2/3 of his life out there for 26 years. One day, they were going to shore in their dory. They used to row one of those small peapod type dories back and forth, like 8 miles to get back and forth to the island. So they were rowing to shore one day, and the boat capsized, or at least was thrown by a wave, so that Mary Abby was thrown into the water, and she was struggling, but he was able to pull her back in. She was okay, I'm sure, but she wasn't very happy. So right around that time, the government decided this would be a so-called stag station, or males-only station after that, so the families didn't live there anymore. But even after that, the families would still come out in the summer. An extended family group would be out there in the summer. This is a picture probably taken around 1900, a little bit after. Here is keeper William C. Williams right here, and his son Charles Williams, who was an assistant to his father for a number of years, and another assistant here, I don't know what his name was, and various family members. These are probably some of the grandchildren of Keeper Williams. You notice there's a flower garden here. There's not a speck of soil on Boone Island naturally, so every spring the keepers and families would bring out soil to the island. They would plant this little flower garden so they'd have a little bit of color in the summer, and come the following fall and winter, it would all be washed away again. They'd have to do it all over again in the spring. I've read some memories of some of the grandchildren of Keeper Williams. One of his granddaughters said that she learned to roller skate on the island on the boardwalks that connected the buildings. You saw, it's just a jumble of rocks otherwise. You can't even really walk around on it very easily. And she said that they really enjoyed the 4th of July out there because they could see fireworks all along the coast. They could, turn their head, and see a wide range of fireworks. She also said that once on the 4th of July, they caught hail in a hailstorm. They caught hail in a bucket and made ice cream out of it, which is probably the only time kids ever had ice cream on Boone Island. So, basically at places like this, kids had to make their own fun. They had no choice. What do you do? Either you're miserable or you figure out a way to have fun. Obviously, they do a lot of fishing and just, like some of the kids in Boston Harbor, there's a lot of good stories about them having rowboat races and pie eating contests, just figuring out various ways to have fun, as the kids here did. They had no choice. Skipping ahead to the 40s, again, briefly, Boone Island became a family station. It was one of many light stations that became a lookout post during the war, during World War II, to watch for enemy vessels. They were afraid of German vessels. Of course, there were plenty of German U-boats along the East Coast. Not so many, if any, surface vessels, and they were mainly watching for surface vessels from these places. They had a lookout tower at Boone Island. They had a large contingent of Coast Guardsmen. And families lived there with some of the Coast Guards. And this is Calvin Dolby in the Coast Guard with one of his children, his wife Miriam, hanging her laundry out by the lighthouse here. I love that picture. So again, briefly, it was a family station. By the way, there was a U-boat sunk near Boone Island during the war, but I haven't been able to find a lot of detail on that. If anybody knows more about the story, let me know. But the story is that a U-boat spotting blimp was able to see this U-boat, and a Navy ship sunk it somewhere near the island. I don't know exactly where. I wish I knew more details on that. Jumping to the early 70s, during the Coast Guard era, these two guys were two of the Coast Guard keepers there in the early 70s, Bob Edwards and Bob Roberts. I spoke with Bob Roberts on the phone a few years ago, and he told me When he showed up at Boone Island, a couple other Coast Guard guys who were there asked him if he believed in ghosts. And he laughed, he thought they were joking, and they said, "You're not going to be laughing much after you're here for a while."
Wow.
So he told me that he very much believed after he was there for a while that the place was haunted. Again, I'll save some of this for my haunted lighthouse lecture, but he said that every time he would go out at night to tend the fog signal, he felt very distinctly like somebody was watching him. And he said when he said that to one of the other guys, they would say, well, that's where all the cannibalism took place, you know, the Nottingham Galley. So I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, he also said that one afternoon, he and Bob Edwards went out fishing, probably in this boat you see in this picture, and they went pretty far from the islands, and they had to really rush back because it was very important that the light be lit at sunset. So they're rushing back to light the light. It was very close to sunset, and as they're coming back, the light came on, apparently by itself. They landed on the island. Nobody was there. The light was on. They never figured out who lit the light that night. So, and I've heard from other Coast Guard keepers that a lot of strange things happen there as well. So, but if you come back for my haunted lecture, I'll get into a little bit more detail. I took this picture in 1990. I'm sure a lot of you remember the blizzard of 1978. During that storm, there were 2 Coast Guard keepers at Boone Island. The island, again, was underwater, as it often has been in storms. And on the second day of the storm, a helicopter came and rescued the 2 keepers. They were basically in the tower most of the time during the storm. The house was badly flooded. The island was virtually underwater. So they were rescued by a helicopter, and the house was badly damaged, and the Coast Guard at that time decided to automate the light and to destroy what was left of the keeper's house. So they set fire to the house soon after that, burned all the wooden parts of it, so all that was left was a little bit of the stone part of that keeper's house. And this generator shed is still there. These storage tanks are gone now. But in this picture, you can see the old Fresnel lens, a second order Fresnel lens that's around 8 feet tall, give or take a bit, that was removed a number of years ago. That lens is now on display at the Kittery Historical and Marine Museum in the town of Kittery, Maine. I don't know if any of you have been there. Have you been there? Yeah. There's probably a few of you have been there. Beautiful lens. There's also displays about Keeper Williams. There's stuff on Boone Island Light and Whaleback Light, which is near there as well. So if you're in the Kittery area, it's right, there's a traffic circle where Route 1 and Route 236 come together near Dairy Queen. Some of you probably know what I'm talking about. So it's pretty easy to get to. It's a really nice little museum, and worth seeing for the lens especially. I took this aerial picture about 5 years ago, so you really see that there's very little left there. This lighthouse, the lighthouse tower itself, first of all, the light is still inactivated to navigation. The Coast Guard still takes care of the light. But this is what's happening all over the country, basically. Even though the Coast Guard is still taking care of many of the lights for navigation, the Coast Guard no longer has the budget to take care of the structures. So it's falling into the hands of nonprofit organizations and communities and so forth to take care of the lighthouses. This lighthouse tower was licensed to the American Lighthouse Foundation in the year 2000. There have been some efforts to raise money for it in, I'm not sure what year it was, but about 7 or 8 years ago, the American Lighthouse Foundation declared it an independent republic, and the then president of the American Lighthouse Foundation dressed up as the Lord Regent Master of Boone Island, and there was a cruise out near the island and so forth. And if you go, excuse me, if you go on the American Lighthouse Foundation website, lighthousefoundation.org, you can still buy citizenships for Boone Island, the Republic of Boone Island. You can also buy political offices. The presidency has probably been sold, 50 times by now. It's a very corrupt nation, so every office is for sale. So that, that's been a fun thing. It's gotten some attention. It's raised several $1,000s, but several $1,000s is nothing when you're talking about a property like this. The stairs inside this tower are falling apart. It's getting so the Coast Guard can barely access the light anymore, and that may, there may have to be major repairs soon if they're going to keep accessing the light. I have organized a couple of events about Boone Island. They're always well attended. People are interested, but to get people to actually step in and work to raise funds, it's another story. So it's been a problem. Right now, this lighthouse is available for transfer. The government just announced very recently that it is available to a suitable new owner, either a nonprofit or community. It's a very stringent application process. The American Lighthouse Foundation Board of Directors has not decided yet whether they will apply for ownership. I understand there are some other interested organizations. If no suitable application is received, it will be auctioned to the general public, which has happened with a whole bunch of lighthouses in recent years. You've probably seen some newspaper stories about that. So we'll see what happens. All we can do is hope for the best. I can't say who's going to end up owning this lighthouse, but within probably a year and a half from now, somebody else besides the federal government will be owning Boone Island Lighthouse.
How does that work? It still has to operate, right? As a light?
The Coast Guard will still operate the light. Whoever owns it will just have to provide right-of-way to the Coast Guard. So that's basically it. I know people are always surprised by that. They think, why can't the Coast Guard maintain it? But the Coast Guard just can't justify that anymore, because as far as they're concerned, if the lighthouse fell over, they could just put more lighted buoys around. They could put up an automated light on a steel tower or something. They don't really need that old structure anymore. So they can't justify putting money into it, putting our tax dollars into it. So that's just the way it is these days. Nothing against the Coast Guard. It's, I know Coast Guard people that love lighthouses. It's not their fault. So moving down the coast, next lighthouse is Whaleback Light, which is the southernmost of 68 Maine lighthouses. Those of you who are familiar with the Portsmouth area know that the Piscataqua River separates the New Hampshire seacoast from the southern Maine coast. And the border between the states goes right through the Isles of Shoals, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. They're down here, and continues right up through the center of the river, so that Whaleback Light is about 1,500 feet on the Maine side of the border between the states. Historically, it is often referred to as a New Hampshire lighthouse, but it's definitely in Maine. This is the second tower built there, and I'll show you what the first lighthouse built at Whaleback Ledge looked like. There have been many shipwrecks at this ledge. Portsmouth, of course, was a leading port in the colonies. There was a lot of shipbuilding going on with the Piscataqua River, among other things. So there were a number of shipwrecks around the mouth of the river on that dangerous ledge. Our technology, excuse me, our technology in those days was not great for building lighthouses in exposed offshore locations like this. We lagged behind England, especially for many years, in building offshore lighthouses. We just didn't want to put the money into it. Our federal government was still growing and just felt that they didn't want to spend the money on stuff like that. So we saved money by building a lighthouse that really wasn't as good as it should have been at Whaleback Ledge. The first lighthouse there was built by 2 contractors for about $25,000, which was a lot more money in 1830, but not enough for a lighthouse like this. It wasn't properly bolted to the ledge. The stones weren't really properly bolted to each other and so forth. It was very rickety. So the keepers feared for their lives right from the start, and it's actually a miracle it never did fall over. Here is a newspaper clipping from one of the storms there in the 1830s at Whales. They often called it Whalesback. Somebody just decided to call it Whalesback or Whaleback because it's sort of at low tide, the ledge sort of looks like a whale's back coming out of the water. And early on it was always referred to as Whalesback Lighthouse. Such was the effect of the sea that the assistants of the keeper could not hear each other speak when in the lantern, on account of the noise produced by the shaking of the apparatus when the sea struck the foundation of the lighthouse, etc. And it goes on to say that the ladder was torn off the lighthouse and so forth. So there were many stories like this in the early days. The keepers complained that in storms, not only was the rattle of the tower deafening, but they said their furniture would bounce around the floors, stones would fall out of the inside walls and so forth. So it had to be absolutely terrifying to live there. Here's another excerpt from a newspaper account of a storm in 1839. The keeper was Joseph Locke, and it says his stout heart quailed when he heard the waves dashing furiously around his isolated tenement, the mad ocean forbidding his departure and threatening every moment to engulf the whole concern. He, by the way, resigned as keeper a very short time after that. In fact, he was hardly there. They say that he hired other people to do the work. That was the problem with a lot of the early lighthouse keepers. This is not Ebenezer Scrooge. Looks kind of, that's what I always think of when I see his picture. But this guy was Stephen Pleasanton, who was the man. His official title was the 5th auditor of the Treasury Department, and he was the man in charge of our lighthouses in this country for about almost the first half of the 19th century, 1800s. And he generally was a notorious penny pincher. That was really the task he was assigned, was to save money for the lighthouse service. He did not want to spend money on if he could help it at all. So this was very rare for him to criticize the building of Whaleback Lighthouse. And but he said, I'm not going to read this whole thing out loud, but he said the plan was excellent, but it wasn't carried out very well. It was infamously built. He talks about how it wasn't properly bolted to the ledge, and how some of the crevices near the bottom, they just stuffed in small stones to fill it up, and those washed out and stuff. So obviously that was a very bad situation. And he said, I'm in daily expectation of information that the present building has been demolished by the force of the sea. So he recommended more money to build a new lighthouse, which was very, very unusual for him, but still Congress put it off for many more years. They did do some repairs to the lighthouse, and somehow it managed to stand for about 42 years before it was rebuilt. Just before the lighthouse was rebuilt, one of the keepers drowned near the lighthouse. His name is Ferdinand Barr, and this is one of 3 deaths I would associate with this lighthouse, which is not unusual for an offshore lighthouse like that. It was a dangerous way of life. Ferdinand Barr was tending his lobster traps one day in rough seas. His 3 children were watching from the lighthouse. Their mother was away on shore, and he disappeared in the waves. He drowned. He was about 30 years old. He was Prussian by birth, as it says here, and a Civil War veteran. So his children flew a distress signal until a fisherman picked them up, and they were saved. So again, I should mention before this, in the 1850s, there was a wife of one of the keepers. She was an official assistant keeper there named Mary Amee, A-M-E-E, and she got tuberculosis and died at the age of 30. And I am sure that that condition was not helped by the very damp, rough conditions at Whaleback Lighthouse. And there was another death a little bit later on that I'll mention. So again, I always tell people lighthouse keeping was not as romantic as people think, for sure. The lighthouse was rebuilt finally in 1872, and they built a new lighthouse right next to the old one. And the new one was built to last. It was built much more properly than the original one, in the style of famous wave-swept lighthouses like Eddystone Light in England and Minot's Ledge Light off the south side of Boston Harbor. Some of you may know that lighthouse. Basically massive granite blocks. They're dovetailed together. They actually kind of fit together like puzzle pieces, and they also have iron dowels holding them together, and of course very strong mortar. So it's really built to withstand just about anything nature can throw at it. Nature has thrown a lot at it since it was built too. A few hurricanes among other things. And you see how they left the old tower standing for a while next to the new lighthouse. The old tower actually for a while served as a fog signal tower. They mounted a foghorn on top, and they continued to use that tower. But it was still rickety, so they finally took it down. And then in 1878, they put up this very unusual looking cast iron fog signal tower. I don't know of any other lighthouse ever that looked anything like this. This thing was painted fire engine red for many years, so it was just taken down in 1969, so I know people that remember it. And the keeper would bring a boat down here. They would bring a boat up in this little cove here on a little ramp. They would haul it up on davits, like you see here. They would enter a doorway here and then go through a passageway into their living quarters inside the lighthouse. And all the equipment for running the foghorns was inside the tower here, and you see 2 horns mounted on top here. And in the old days, those would have been very powerful steam foghorns. Some of the old horns were said to be so powerful that if a seagull flew in front of them while they were blasting, that's the end of the seagull, just boom, just drop it out of the air. And that's not an exaggeration. This guy, Leander White, was from Newcastle, New Hampshire, right near there, and he was keeper for a while in the 1880s, later became keeper at Portsmouth Harbor Light. This is something that was written about him near the end of his career. He was very highly respected. In 1886, he was out at Whaleback Light for a winter storm. They say a wave crashed through one of the windows of the lighthouse, and he happened to be near the window, and he was injured. And he flew a distress signal, and finally, when the seas died down, a man from Kittery came over and picked him up and took him to get medical help. He was okay. And coincidentally, the man who came over and got him out of the lighthouse later became keeper. His name was Walter Amee, and he was there 28 years, keeper at Whaleback Light. I wish I had a picture of him, but I don't. But he was credited with many rescues around the lighthouse during his years there. And I know there's still some Amee family in that area, and I've been trying to get a picture of keeper Amee, but I haven't got one yet. This is Arnold White, who was the son of Leander White, the keeper I just showed you. And he ended up being keeper at Whaleback Light for 20 years, which is, to me, anything over a week at Whaleback Light is a lot. And he was very well respected. I think I'm sure he was a great guy, but a big reason why assistant keepers loved serving with this guy was that he was considered one of the best cooks in the lighthouse service. I have an article about him that describes it. It said that this reporter said the meal that was served when, I think it was a woman, when she was there, was an Epicurean's delight, she said. And one of the specialties was peach pies. He was an excellent baker, I guess. And he had the same 2 assistant keepers serving with him for 20 years. The same 3 guys served out there for 20 years together. They would rotate, so 2 of them would always be out there. They must have gotten along very well, and I guess they also really enjoyed his food. I've talked to his daughter. She lives in Newcastle. Her name is Marion Petlick. She's in her 90s now. And she says that she loved to go out there when she was a girl and fish from the rocks. And she said her father always had pies or bread pudding cooling on the windowsills when she went out there. So it always smelled good inside the lighthouse. This is 1957 from a magazine article, a couple of young Coast Guard guys working on the air compressors and oil engines for the fog signals. They look like kids, don't they? Because they were. I believe they're about 18 years old. In those days, the Coast Guard was sending out very young guys to these offshore lighthouses. It was basically sink or swim, pretty much, literally. In fact, one of these two guys, I'm not sure which one it was in this picture, but one of these two guys, just before this picture was taken, on New Year's Eve, 1956/7, he was trying to get to shore for a party or whatever, and he took a motorboat from the lighthouse, and the motor died, and on a very, very cold night, he was drifting out to sea. And they say a Coast Guard cutter went out and finally found him after 3 or 4 hours, so he was lucky to be alive, really. But they say in this fog signal tower, the temperature could get up to 140, and the noise was deafening. So probably 18-year-old kids were the only ones that could get to put up with that, I don't know. But I actually know a Coast Guard guy who was one of the last keepers there. I'll tell you about him in a second. This is the old Fresnel lens, used to be at Whaleback, a very beautiful revolving fourth order lens. Fourth order refers to the size. It's like a medium-sized lens, about maybe so high. And as this revolved around the light source, these flash panels or bullseye panels created the flash of the light as those were pointing towards you if you're in a boat. This beautiful lens was removed in 1963 when the light was automated, and it is now in storage at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. It's never been on display, it's just been boxed up there. And they unboxed it so I could photograph it a couple of years ago, but kind of too bad that it's not on display somewhere. There's been a succession of various lights out at Whaleback. Today there's an LED light, it's about this big, and it flashes twice every 10 seconds. It used to have this beautiful sweeping light across the water. Now it's kind of like ping, ping, almost like a little strobe light. So I think some of the romance is gone. But the Coast Guard's, concerned about having the best, most efficient light for the least amount of money at this point. And LEDs are very easy to maintain. And solar powered, as most offshore lighthouses are now. I took this picture on April 16th, 2007, during a major nor'easter that came up the coast. And especially if you live near the water, you might remember that storm. It did a lot of damage on the New Hampshire seacoast, especially around Rye. And that lighthouse is 70 feet tall, by the way. So the waves are hitting the rocks out there and breaking right over the top of the lighthouse. A friend of mine who was actually near me in the same area taking pictures at high tide that day got one picture of a wave twice the height of the lighthouse, about 140 feet high. So all I can think of when I see this kind of thing is imagine living inside that lighthouse where this kind of stuff is going on. Imagine living inside that first lighthouse that shook like crazy in storms. This one I wouldn't worry about too much, but that first one had to be a nightmare. In 2007, the federal government put up the lighthouse for transfer, and the American Lighthouse Foundation was interested in going for it. I founded the local chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation, the Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse, which I'll tell you more about, and we thought that maybe our chapter could take on a second lighthouse. So we went out to inspect it with the Coast Guard, and here's a picture of what the entryway looked like at that time. It was basically abandoned by the Coast Guard after they automated it in 1963, so the interior has fallen into extremely bad shape. All rusty, as you can see. This is what they call efflorescence on the brick, or white stuff that forms from moisture in there. The Coast Guard has removed a lot of their old equipment, so this stuff is all gone now, but it gives you an idea that it's in pretty rough shape in there. The wooden floors on some levels are very soft and feel spongy when you step on them. It's a little scary, but there is a metal floor underneath those, so you're not going to go falling through the whole thing. But anyway, this is during one of our visits out there. We did get ownership of it. I completed the application. I worked for months on it. It took about a year to get approval. In the summer of '09, we did get ownership of the lighthouse. So these two guys are Dean Rikerson, who is a historic preservation architect in Kittery, who's been working with us a lot on this project. Ross Tracy is the current chairman of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. We've made maybe 5 visits out there now. We are formulating plans for a dock out there. We have an engineer working with us too, and right now they're working up what's called a request for proposals to try to get a contractor to give us a price, get bids on the work. There's going to be 2 phases. One is moving some of those rocks around out there to recreate the sheltered cove that used to be there. Phase 2 will be to have a steel dock that will be bolted to those rocks. We're probably talking for the 2 phases combined from $50,000 to $100,000. And then to fully restore the interior of the lighthouse, you're talking several $100,000 more. Some of the stones just below the lantern level are cracked, and to properly restore it, the lantern is going to have to be sort of jacked up. We're talking about removing it, but that's a pretty major thing in itself. So it'll probably be sort of jacked up, and some of those rocks will have to be replaced or at least repaired. So you're talking big, big bucks. If anybody knows any billionaires who love lighthouses, you know where to send them. We'll be applying for grants, but we really don't know where all the money's going to come from. It's probably going to come from a number of different sources. But if you give us, I'm saying at least 2 or 3 years from now, I'm not setting a date, but I hope you can all join us for a boat tour out to Whaleback Light in a couple of years or so. This shows one of our visits out there. This time we were taken out in a larger boat by a local captain, Neil Odoms, and he always tells people we look like Navy SEALs going ashore that day. This was at high tide when the current is really running there at the mouth of the river, and it's very hard to land a boat on the rocks out there. We tried low tide, high tide, in between. It's never easy. It's always an adventure when you get on there. There's nowhere to land a boat, no good place out there at all. That's the team that did the historic structure report for us on it, Dean Rikerson. This guy, Ivan Meyer, actually did masonry work for the White House. So he's pretty high level, and he helped work on the structure report for us. And this guy, this is Ross Tracy again of our chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation. Jim Pope was one of the last Coast Guard keepers at Whaleback Light in the early 60s. He was out there when he was about 19 years old. Loves to talk about it. He lives in Elliott, Maine. Calls himself the Pope of Elliott. And he was a tugboat captain for many years after he left the Coast Guard, and he's now retired. And he has sort of a stand-up comedy routine about his early days at Whaleback Light, and it's almost like R-rated, so I can't say. He talks about how they lived on lobsters and Spam out there, and he says the water cistern in the basement, the water would freeze in the winter, so even if you just wanted a cup of coffee, you'd have to chop out a block of ice to make coffee out of it. So it was an interesting way of life. He had a girlfriend in Kittery, and I guess he was rowing ashore just about every night to visit his girlfriend. He thought nobody knew about it, but actually everybody knew about it. He's got a lot of good stories. We gave him a lifetime membership. That's what he's being handed right there. All right, 2 more lighthouses to tell you about. White Island Light is at the southernmost of the Isles of Shoals. Isles of Shoals, for those of you who don't know, probably you all know, but they're a group of 9 islands off the New Hampshire seacoast. Actually, even though they look like they're closer to New Hampshire than they are to Maine, here's the border between the states here, but the border actually goes right through the center of the islands. So the upper or northern islands are part of Maine, and the southern ones are part of New Hampshire. Appledore Island, the largest of the islands, is part of Maine. But White Island, where the lighthouse is part of New Hampshire, making it one of our 2 New Hampshire lighthouses. And it is very much in shipping lanes, so that's why I've got an early lighthouse in 1821. This is the only photo I've ever seen of the first lighthouse there. It was a stone lighthouse. It looks wooden in this picture because it had problems with leaks at first. Excuse me. And they put like a wooden sheath around it to stop the leaks. Let me show you the person who was the, whoops, okay, it's coming up next, I think. This is a clipping from when the light went into service in 1821, actually December 1st, 1820. They're announcing the light was about to go into service. The important thing I want you to read here is the end of this. It says that the light exhibited on one side a bright red light, on one side a blue, and on the other the natural color of the light, which was a white light. So in other words, this is the only case I know of in American history of a lighthouse that had a red, white, and blue flash. It's never happened before or since that I'm aware of. It didn't last very long. They got rid of the blue flash after a little while because blue light doesn't actually show very well. It can't be seen for a long way at night. White and red lights actually carry much farther. So it had a white and red flash for many years. Now it's simply a white flash. This is Celia Thaxter. I'm sure a lot of you here have heard of her. She was the daughter of a keeper at White Island. She's, I'd say, the most famous person who ever lived there. Her father was Thomas Layton. He became keeper in 1839 after a career as a local politician. He was postmaster, among other things, in Portsmouth. Some people say he became disgusted with local politics, decided to move out to the islands. He actually bought 3 of the Isles of Shoals, and he got the appointment as lighthouse keeper. And Celia was only 4 when they moved out there. They had two children, her brother Oscar and her parents moved out there in 1839. And Celia later married her father's business partner, Levi Thaxter, and she became Celia Thaxter, and she became the most famous writer and poet from the New Hampshire seacoast region ever. She wrote about White Island in many of her poems, and also especially in her book Among the Isles of Shoals, which isn't too hard to find. And her other book, An Island Garden, is still very much in print. Among the Isles of Shoals is a little harder to find, but I love this passage where she wrote about when they first arrived at the island, when she was only 4 years old. She said, "It was at sunset in autumn. We were set ashore on that loneliest, lovely rock, where the lighthouse looked down on us like some tall, black-capped giant, and filled me with awe and wonder. At its base, a few goats were grouped on the rock, standing out against the red sky as I looked up at them. Someone began to light the lamps in the tower, rich red and golden. They swung around in midair. Everything was strange and fascinating and new." It's another passage I love. She talked about going out on the island at night, and she said, "High above, the lighthouse rays streamed out into the humid dark, and the cottage windows were ruddy from the glow within. I felt so much a part of the Lord's universe, I was no more afraid of the dark than the wave of the winds." This is when she was a very small girl. I think that's a very beautiful passage. And she mentions the lighthouse in a number of her poems, including Wreck of the Pocahontas. It's a pretty famous poem she wrote. She was also an artist. Celia actually painted this painting of White Island Light. It's not well known that she was an artist, but they had an exhibit of her work at the Portsmouth Athenaeum a few years ago. She, later on, when her family ran a hotel for many years on Appledore Island, where she became one of the centers of literary activity in New England, to make extra money, she would paint scenes on plates and sell them to tourists. So they had some of those on display at the Athenaeum a few years ago, but she really was a very good artist. Her brother was Oscar Layton, known to everybody as Uncle Oscar. Lived to be 99 years old, just short of his 100th birthday. They say he only went to the mainland once in his life. I believe he was 16 years old the first time he went to the mainland. He said he had trouble walking. It felt weird to him not being on an island, so he just couldn't stand it, so he went right back to the island. Spent most of his life on Star Island, at the old Oceanic Hotel, which is now part of a conference center. The Unitarian Universalist Church has a conference center there. Anyway, he wrote a book called 90 Years at the Isles of Shoals, and this is a little passage from that, where he said, "Many people have said you must have been very lonely at the light. They did not know where our mother dwelt, but there was happiness also. I am sure no family was ever more united and contented than the Laytons on White Island." The lighthouse was rebuilt in 1859 as the lighthouse we have today, a 58-foot brick tower. They left part of the old lighthouse standing and made a fog bell tower out of it. For years there was a bell hanging on the water side of that structure. There's another photo from the late 1800s. They built a new duplex Victorian house, a very beautiful house in the 1870s. The original house was actually taken down. They put a smaller storage shed in its place. Since then, this was taken down and a house was put back on that original footprint, so it looks a lot like the original house now. But that beautiful Victorian house was torn down by the Coast Guard in the 50s, so that's no longer there. Another artist who painted many scenes of the Isles of Shoals, including White Island, was Childe Hassam, a very famous American Impressionist painter. He did the illustrations for Celia Thaxter's book, An Island Garden, painted White Island a few times, and one of his paintings is on the cover of a book called Friendly Edifices, and I just want to recommend that if anybody wants to read in more detail the history of the 5 lighthouses that I'm talking about tonight. This book was written by Jane Malloy Porter, who was in charge of the Portsmouth Athenaeum for some years. She spent many years researching this. It's a thick book. You don't want to read it all in one sitting or in a few sittings, but it's a great reference book. It's officially out of print, but you can still find copies around. This guy, James Burke, was keeper at White Island, I think it was 1894 to 1912. He was a later keeper at the Nubble Light. He was from Portsmouth. There's a picture of him when he was quite young and a picture when he was older. This text here was written by his wife in a newspaper article while they were living out there, and it's a very interesting passage. "I'm feeling much better since the beautiful springtime has come. The mornings are delightful here now. The birds are giving their morning songs, and that seems to put new life into one, while the sun, as it peeps out of the sea so early these fine mornings, seems to bring new strength to go forward to aid life's duties. All through the short days of winter I was kept busy as we had the assistant to board with us. My daughter Emma, being away this winter, made more steps for me to take. Since that time I have had 3 men sent by the government to repair what the sea washed to pieces in the heavy storms of winter. The storms were beautiful to watch from the windows, but little Lucy, their daughter, was so afraid that she cried with fright, and I kept her in the sitting room busy cutting out paper dolls until the storm subsided. Sheets of salt water would strike the windows and sound like the fiercest hailstorm." White Island was a family station until the Coast Guard took over. Under the Coast Guard, it became a males only or stag station. This is 1950, a couple of Coast Guard keepers with the girlfriend of one of them, and I'm not sure which guy it was, but he later married this woman, because I've been told in my lectures in the area, and talked to people who knew her. I guess she just recently passed away, but she did marry one of those guys. And this is the old second order lens from White Island, around 8 or 9 feet tall, this lens, beautiful lens, removed in the late 1980s when the light was automated. And nobody knows what happened to it. A 9-foot tall lens disappeared. So I won't say any more about that. This is a video clip I'm going to play for you. This is silent, and this was taken during the blizzard of '78. It's not the greatest quality, but it tells a story here. This is from the keeper's house, which is about 30 to 40 feet above the water, the normal surface of the water. So these waves are washing right up onto the island. They're actually moving a storage shed around, you can see in parts of this. You can see the boathouse near the storage shed. Again, just touch on a ghost story here, because I'll save most of those for later. But a friend of mine who's a Coast Guard officer told me that a friend of his was one of the Coast Guardsmen during that storm on White Island. He said that as the storm was coming in, he was near the boathouse trying to secure things the best he could. He said that as he was doing that, the apparition of a woman in white appeared in front of him. And the woman in white on the Isles of Shoals is a very common legend that's been said many times. He said that this apparition actually spoke to him and said something to the effect of, "Everything will be fine," more or less. I'm not sure that a ghost talking to me like that would reassure me that much. But as it turned out, you know, there was damage obviously, but it wasn't that bad. It was actually much worse at Boone Island to the north. So anyway, but I'll tell a little bit more of the ghost stories when I come back here in October. Here's the evolution of the lights at White Island, which is pretty much what Whaleback has gone through also. The old Fresnel lens is replaced by a rotating aerobeacon type light, the type they used to use at airports. Then replaced by what's called a BRB 25. It's about this big, are made in New Zealand. It cost about $25,000, a plastic rotating light. And then that's been replaced just a couple of years ago by an LED light that's solar powered. And again, it just has a very quick, bright flash, almost like a strobe light. Flashes every 15 seconds. So it's gone through, in only about 25 years, it's gone through 4 different types of lights out there. White Island Light became the property of the state of New Hampshire in 1993. This is then Governor Judd Gregg of New Hampshire on the far right here, shaking hands with a Coast Guard officer. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It went under the State Parks and Recreation Department. But in the ensuing years, it seems like the state sort of forgot that they owned it, as far as I could tell, and it was falling into ruin. It was basically totally neglected. The brick surface of the lighthouse was developing these cracks, and every year they were getting worse. Ice would get in those cracks in the winter and expand, and bricks were falling out all over the place, so it was really looking dire. That's the bad news, but the good news is that a local teacher named Sue Reynolds at the Northampton School, a 7th grade science teacher, started a program called the Lighthouse Kids. I went out to the island with them a few times some years ago. These kids, this is like 10 or so years ago, so these kids are probably all graduated college by now. But over the course of several years, these kids would speak to local groups, they would apply for grants and so forth, try to raise awareness and funds. Over a number of years, they raised over $200,000. Each year, 7th graders would get involved, new kids each year. They raised over $200,000. They got a $250,000 matching grant from the federal government, Save America's Treasures program. And in 2005, they got the lighthouse restored. The state, I think, was embarrassed into kicking a little money into it. Here's one of the kids measuring a crack on the lighthouse, one of the times I went out with them. Here is Sue Reynolds, the teacher who started the program, with the blue jacket on here. She's now retired, but she's still involved. Her son, Pete Reynolds, now owns Granite State Whale Watch out of Rye, and a couple of the Lighthouse kids here during one of the visits. And here's part of the restoration, 2005. Ritchie Construction out of Portsmouth and Leslie Masonry out of South Berwick, Maine did a lot of the work. They repointed all the brick and replaced a lot of the bricks, put like a stucco material over it, which has since worn away, and they had to go back out and put a more durable material. At first they were told by the historic preservation experts, you have to put this old-fashioned stucco on, and that washed off like within a year. So they had to put they finally allowed them to put a more durable coating on it. So it's looking pretty good these days. They also replaced the Coast Guard's glass block windows with windows that look more like the original windows. The stairway was painted inside by somebody from F.A. Gray Company in Portsmouth. One guy painted the whole stairway by himself, and also painted the entire lantern, the cast iron top of the lighthouse all by himself, which is pretty amazing. There's a picture around that time when it was restored. See these big solar panels. Those solar panels, along with the covered walkway between the house and tower, were all washed away in April of '07 when there was a huge storm. I showed you that giant wave over Whaleback. This is the same storm. You see a little bit of rubble of the walkway right here. That's all that was left. And again, that's the bad news, this part of the story. But just last year, the walkway was restored. It was rebuilt. This is pictures. This is some video of a helicopter flying in the supports for the walkway. And you can see here the walkway is being rebuilt when I took this picture. Supposedly it's built in such a way that it's going to withstand storms much better than the old one. It's been rebuilt many times over the years. And one of the first times it was washed out was when Celia Thaxton found it. This goes on for a little while, but you get the idea, so you support the in there. Okay, but I know I'm probably talking longer than I should. I've already gone over an hour here, but just a few more minutes, just one more lighthouse to tell you about. Portsmouth Harbor Light is in the town of Newcastle, New Hampshire. This is basically my home base. I've spent a lot of my life here in the past 12 years. It's at the northeast corner of the town of Newcastle, which is really an island connected by a couple of bridges. Historically, it's known as Great Island. It's about a mile from the mouth of the Piscataqua River. Whaleback Light is out here. And this was built originally in 1771, the first lighthouse here, because Portsmouth was such an important harbor in the early colonies, with a lot of shipbuilding, along with fishing and trade and so forth. This is a drawing of the original 1771 lighthouse, which was the first lighthouse north of Boston in the colonies, which shows you what an important harbor Portsmouth was. This is probably an extremely inaccurate drawing because the lighthouse looks like it's about 500 feet tall here compared to the houses. It's really only about 50 feet tall, so this is not accurate at all. But it's one of the few drawings we have of that first tower. The fort next to the lighthouse at that time was called Fort William and Mary. It's now Fort Constitution. Soldiers at Fort William and Mary, the British soldiers, took care of the lighthouse in the earliest days. And then, of course, after the Revolution, it was renamed Fort Constitution. And the federal government formed a lighthouse service in 1789. And then in 1804, they decided to build a new lighthouse, and they built it a couple of hundred feet away from the original location. They built it on a rock that juts out a little bit more into the shipping channel there in the Piscataqua River. This is a drawing of the 1804 tower, which was 80 feet tall, compared to 48 feet for the present lighthouse, so quite tall and octagonal, made of wood. In fact, it was so tall they decided it was too tall after a while. Once Whaleback Light was established, Whaleback kind of replaced this as the primary guide for shipping traffic coming in there. They felt this light was less important, so they sawed off the top 25 feet so it wouldn't be seen so far. I always picture a bunch of guys with a giant hacksaw. But that's what it looked like for quite a while. It kind of sawed off because it was. Then in 1878, they built this new cast iron lighthouse, very much like the Noble Light, but a little bit taller, 48 feet compared to 41 feet. And they prefabricated the cast iron cylinders at a foundry in Portland, floated them down to Newcastle, and took away part of that old wooden lighthouse, assembled this inside it. Then when they finished assembling this, they took away the rest of the old wooden lighthouse. So they had to build it right on the same spot. They had to be pretty creative about how they did it. Here's a picture from 1896, a couple of women in their 1896 clothes here. The fog bell was put in place at that time. Again, the keeper would have to crank up a machine in the shed here every time the bell needed to be sounded and for visibility. And another early photo from the, probably from the 1880s, showing the cannons in place on the old granite wall of Fort Constitution right there. Wood Island out here now has a life-saving station on it, had a quarantine station at that time where incoming vessels, if there was somebody with scarlet fever or whatever, they would be put in that hospital, and quite a few people died out there of scarlet fever. This guy, Joshua Card, was the longest serving keeper of Portsmouth Harbor Light, 35 years, 1874 to 1909. Local man who went to sea at the age of 12. Looks like an old salt, I would say. And very highly respected in the area. Loved to show people around his lighthouse. Sometimes people, when they see this picture, more than once I've had people say, he looks like the captain in Titanic. He says, but anyway, they say the lighthouse was like his baby. He loved showing people around there. Became a fixture in town there. And it's a little hard to see, but this old uniform, the old civilian keeper's uniform, I think you've seen it in some of the other pictures, it had the letter K on the lapels, which stood for keeper keepers. But they say when Joshua Card was showing people around there, if they asked him what the K stood for, he always told them it stood for captain. Yeah. So we call him Captain with a K. I really think he knew how to spell. I think he enjoyed being called captain, which was a sign of respect for lighthouse keepers anyway. People call lighthouse keepers captain in general, so, you know, they knew him as Captain Card for sure. I love this picture of him with his dog on the walkway. So when we have open houses there, sometimes I'll ask kids, what do you think his dog's name was? We don't know what it was, but I'm looking for a good name for it. A kid the other day said Moxie. That's a pretty good name. I think he looks like a Rex or something like that. We don't know his name. This guy, Henry Cuskley, was keeper for 26 years. His wife became famous for her Sunday dinners. They'd have lots of local people over for Sunday dinner. Especially her raspberry custard tarts became very famous. Always sound really good to me. They say that when the lighthouse inspector was coming, they would never know when they were coming. It was always unannounced. They would do these white glove inspections. A neighbor said that she would always see things flying out of the windows when Mrs. Cuskley was cleaning up to get things out of the way. She would be frantically throwing things out the windows. It may have been an exaggeration, I'm not sure. But he was very involved in the community, Henry Cuskley. He was president of the school board, among other things, while he was there. Then the last keeper at Portsmouth Harbor Light was Elson Small. He came in 1946 with his wife Connie. And here are Elson and Connie Small in front of Portsmouth Harbor Light. Before they came to this station, they had lived only on islands off the Maine coast for 26 years. This is the first place they lived where they didn't have to take a boat to get to their home, so they were thrilled. Connie got to take part in community activities, church activities, and so forth for the first time. It was also the first place that had electricity that they ever lived in. And here's a picture of a storm at the lighthouse, and you see the big wave hitting the lighthouse here, and you also see they had storm signal flags there. The Weather Service put these steel towers at many locations along the coast. There's still a few of them standing. And it was a job of the lighthouse keepers, or in this case it became one of Connie Small's duties, even though she wasn't paid for it, as the keeper's wife, to fly signal flags if there was a hurricane warning or gale warning or whatever it might be. And before I go further here, let me just tell you that I got to know Connie Small in her late years when she was in her 90s. I videotaped an interview with her when she was 96. And I'm going to play you two clips from that interview. And first I'm going to play you a clip where she talks about the storm signal flags. And I'm going to hope the volume's at a reasonable level here. So let's just give this a shot. I might have to start it over again if the volume's too soft or too loud here. But let's give this a shot. Again, she's talking about flying the storm signal flags here.
Of course, I had to put the signals up, you see, and those flags, those flags are 8 feet long. Those, the ones that you put up for the hurricanes and the pendants, of course, are that long, but they're this way, you see. But of course, when it rained, Elson wouldn't let me touch them because they were so heavy. He didn't want me to touch them for that. Well, sometimes we would just fly them once when they wouldn't be acceptable to the plane. And I couldn't see all that good material go to waste, throw overboard. So I cut out all that was good and made quilts out of them. And I made a quilt for everyone in my family.
I wish we had one of those quilts now.
Oh, yeah.
She did make a quilt that's now on display at the Maine Lighthouse Museum in Rockland, Maine, but it's not one of the ones she's talking about. It was a quilt she made at another lighthouse called the St. Croix River Light. The quilt shows different scenes of life there, shows their truck and their cow and their cat. Every panel is a different scene of life at that lighthouse. As I said, this was also the first lighthouse that had electricity that Connie and Elson ever lived at. So it's quite a thrill to have electricity, but I've got one more video clip to play for you of Connie talking about having electricity for the first time.
We always look forward to electricity, of course, and the first electricity was when we came to Portsmouth Harbor. And of course he said, well, we'll go up and get the light. So we went up and finally he said, press the button, and I pressed the button, and I no more feeling, I've got about it right now. And I thought, what has happened? What is the reason? So I went down to the kitchen, sat down, and began to think about it. What in the world, why wasn't I? When we look forward to it as a big thing, then I realized we had to give 20 minutes of ourselves to light that light. And we had put part of us into it. And that made it something. But just to press a button, that was nothing. You see what I mean? And so that's my first. But when I went back and went in the house, So what I could do, we went on electric binge, bought everything we could electric.
She was just a delightful person. I think you can see that. Again, she's 96 in these clips here. If you get on YouTube, there's actually a couple of other clips as well. If you search for Connie Small, you'll find 4 different clips from my interview with her. Just a really neat person. And by the way, when she was 85 years old, she wrote a wonderful book called The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife. And if anybody wants to read more about what it was like to live at lighthouses in that era, it's a fantastic book. We sell it at our open houses, of course, with Harbor Light. You can buy it online from various sources. Just a really wonderful book. And she was a neat person. I'm going to say a little bit more about her in a minute. But here's a picture of Portsmouth Harbor Light from the water. And again, in 2001, I founded Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse as a chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation. In 2003, we gave her a certificate to Connie Small as our honorary chairperson. She's 101 years old in these pictures. She passed away at 103 in 2005. And she was sharp as a tack. She was amazing. So we started having open houses a number of years ago, actually 12 years ago now, so we're in our 12th season. The Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse is open every Sunday afternoon, 1 to 5. Line's kind of long here. Some weeks it gets a little long, but sometimes there's no line at all. You never know. We usually have 100 to 150 visitors on a Sunday afternoon. There's one of our volunteers, Ruth, here, talking to some people at the top of the stairs. We have volunteers who tell you some of the history of the lighthouse when you're there. Of course, we talk about Connie Small and Joshua Card and so forth. But if you're looking for something to do on a Sunday afternoon, come on by. I'm usually there on a Sunday afternoon, and you get to go to the top. Of course, the stairs here, we have a 4th order Fresnel lens still in place with a green cylinder that produces a fixed green light. Our light doesn't flash. And there's a few of us on the stairs. We just painted the stairs a couple of months ago. You can still smell the fresh paint when you go in there. We painted the stairs and other surfaces in there, so everything's looking really nice. In our 12 years there, we've put over $50,000 into this lighthouse, by the way. So it ain't cheap to maintain these things. And we've had some paranormal investigations, and without going deeply into that, I'll just mention we occasionally have haunted tours at night, we call them. It's one of our important fundraisers. We do it 4 times. We're doing it 4 times this year. The dates still to come this year are August 25th and September 29th. If you get on our website, portsmouthharborlighthouse.org. Here are some websites I just want to mention. The American Lighthouse Foundation and the chapter Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse is my own website, lighthouse.cc. I always tell people to remember that, but because when you're at a lighthouse, you CC. You get it? That's terrible. I have a little company, New England Lighthouse Tours. I give tours in my minivan for groups of no more than 5 people a couple of days a week, where we go to 6 lighthouses in a day, based in Portsmouth. LighthouseKids.com, you can read about what they're up to. And I've probably gone much longer than I should have. You probably need to close the library in 5 minutes.
7.
Okay. We have time for any quick questions, maybe. I don't know if anybody has any questions for me, but I'd be happy to. But thank you very much for your patience.
Yeah, I just have a question. The different styles of lighthouses. Some of them are square, some of them are cone shaped, some of them are cylinder shaped like boom.
Why are there so many different?
Yes, and who determined what style lighthouse was going to be?
That's a really good question. It's hard to answer in just a few words, but basically different styles came into vogue, and then it depended on what architects and engineers were being employed by the lighthouse establishment at that time. They all had their pet designs, and it depended on the terrain too, obviously, whether it was on a small rock or on an island. But they're just, there'd be one type of, maybe be 4 or 5 similar lighthouses built around within a few years. Then they get onto the next fad or whatever and build a few that look like that. So it really depended on a lot of it on the taste of
architects.
Yeah, architects and engineers were involved in designing the lighthouses. There were some very important architects involved in some of them, like Alexander Paris. People may have heard of him. He was involved in some of them. H.H. Richardson was pretty famous too. Was involved a bit. So.
So I just always wondered that. It's just different styles and
Yeah,
who determined and who approved.
Some people say, "Ah, lighthouse is a lighthouse." Well, that's
yeah,
not
but
true.
no, it's not. Right.
Many different kinds. Yeah,
right.
yeah. Anybody else?
The lens down at Peabody Museum.
Yeah.
You said it was boxed. Don't they
Yes.
have a maritime room? That would be a perfect.
Well, I don't have any say in that. I think it should be on display, but it never
Don't
has
they
been.
have it? Do they have it?
Oh, they have.
maritime?
It's mostly maritime stuff in the museum. Yeah.
Mhm.
It seems logical that they would display it, but they never have. There used to be a gigantic first order Fresnel lens on display at the Boston Museum of Science. That's the first light, I worked there when I was in college. That's the first lens I ever saw, I think. It's now back at its lighthouse in New Jersey, the Navasink twin lights, but it's a 10-foot tall lens, incredible one. Anybody else? I'm gonna thank you very much.
Thank you all.